You don't arrive at a moment like this by accident. You arrive because something inside you endured a year that was never meant to be gentle. A year that didn't pass quietly. It pressed on you, stripped you, and asked more than you thought you could give. There were mornings when you opened your eyes and felt the weight before you even remembered why. There were nights when you lay still, staring into the dark, wondering if this was all there was, if this heaviness had become your new normal. And somewhere in the middle of it all, in a moment you might not even remember clearly, you made a quiet decision. Not a grand declaration, not a promise written down, just a whisper from the deepest part of you that said, "I will not let this break me." That whisper brought you here, to this video, to this exact moment. And if you're watching this now, it's because 2026 is the year everything that was prepared in the darkness finally unfolds in the light. Before we speak about what's ahead, we need to honor what you've already carried. There were days you woke up tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Not exhaustion in the body, exhaustion in the chest. A heaviness that settled there like fog, thick and unmoving, making even the simplest tasks feel like climbing a mountain. You carried unanswered prayers, delayed hopes, strength you never asked to develop. You showed up for people who didn't show up for you. You held space for conversations that drained you. You smiled through moments when your soul was screaming for rest. And in the quiet moments, the ones no one sees, you wondered if you were being punished, forgotten, or simply asking for too much from life. You wondered if maybe you had done something wrong, if perhaps this struggle was proof that you weren't worthy of ease, of joy, of the simple grace of things falling into place. But here's what I need you to understand before we go any further. Those thoughts, those dark, heavy thoughts that visited you in the middle of the night, they don't make you weak. They make you human. They make you someone who has been carrying a weight that was never meant to be carried alone. And yet somehow, you're still here, still breathing, still searching, still believing, even if that belief has been reduced to the faintest flicker of light. That flicker is enough. It brought you to this moment, and this moment is where everything begins to shift. A revelação central. Não era para recompensar. Here is the truth that reframes everything. That season was not designed to reward you. It was designed to prepare you. And I know how unfair that sounds. I know how much easier it would be to hear that your struggle had a clear purpose, that every tear had an immediate return, that every sacrifice came with instant recognition. But preparation never looks like reward while it's happening. Preparation looks like loss. It looks like delay. It looks like doors closing in your face just when you thought you were finally close enough to walk through them. Your mind was searching for relief, for a sign that things were getting better, for proof that your efforts weren't in vain. But the universe wasn't operating on the timeline of relief. It was operating on the timeline of alignment, and alignment requires precision. It requires that everything within you and around you matches the frequency of what's trying to reach you. What felt like a delay was actually recalibration. What felt like rejection was redirection. What felt like punishment was protection from paths that would have taken you further away from your true destination. You didn't fail. You were being trained. Trained to hold more without collapsing. Trained to see clearly, even when the fog was thick. Trained to trust your inner voice even when every external voice told you to give up. Every moment of that year, every ache, every disappointment, every time you had to choose between what was comfortable and what was true, you were being shaped into someone capable of receiving what's coming next. Because what's coming isn't small, it isn't ordinary, and the version of you that existed before that difficult season wouldn't have been able to hold it. The endings, the delays, the silence, the moment things fell apart, right when they seemed to align. None of it was random. None of it was chaos disguised as fate. The universe wasn't closing doors to hurt you. It was removing exits that would have led you away from who you're becoming. Think about the relationship that ended even though you tried everything to save it. Think about the opportunity that slipped through your fingers even though you were perfectly qualified. Think about the friendship that faded even though you kept reaching out. In those moments, it felt like punishment. It felt like the universe was turning its back on you, like you were being denied something you had earned, something you deserved. But what if those doors closed because staying in those spaces would have kept you small? What if that relationship had to end because it was built on a version of you that no longer exists? What if that opportunity fell through because it would have locked you into a path that had nothing to do with your true calling? What if that friendship faded because the energy exchange was no longer equal, and staying would have drained the very life force you needed to step into what's next? The universe operates with a kind of precision we can't always see in the moment. It redirects, it protects, it removes what can't come with you into the next chapter, not out of cruelty, but out of love, out of a deep knowing that you are destined for something far greater than what you were clinging to. Every closed door was a course correction. Every painful ending was a necessary release, and every moment of silence was the universe holding space for you to finally hear your own voice again. There is a law that governs every transformation in existence. Nothing enters a higher state without releasing what can't come with it. The caterpillar doesn't become a butterfly by adding wings to what it already is. It dissolves completely. It surrenders its entire form, its entire identity, and in that dissolving, in that complete letting go, something entirely new emerges. Water doesn't become steam by staying water. It has to release its current state, surrender to the heat, allow itself to be transformed into something it has never been before. This is the law, and it applies to you just as much as it applies to everything else in nature. You tried to hold on to the familiar because it felt safe. You tried to keep relationships that had already served their purpose because the unknown felt too vast, too uncertain. You tried to maintain identities that no longer fit because shedding them felt like losing yourself. But here's what actually happens when you try to carry forward what was never meant to come with you. You stay stuck between two worlds. You're no longer who you were, but you haven't yet become who you're meant to be. You exist in a kind of limbo, carrying the weight of a past that's already gone and resisting the future that's trying to arrive. That resistance creates suffering, not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're fighting against a natural law. The universe had to strip away the old so the new could take root. It had to remove the relationships that were based on who you used to be. It had to end the patterns that kept you cycling through the same pain. It had to silence the voices that told you to play small, to settle, to accept less than what your soul was calling for. You didn't choose to let go. The season forced your hand, and in that forcing, in that divine pressure, you were freed. That season forced your hand. It asked you to let go of versions of yourself that survived, but were never meant to thrive. You had spent so long in survival mode that you forgot what it felt like to actually live. You adapted to environments that required you to shrink. You learned to tolerate treatment that should have never been tolerated. You developed patterns of thinking that kept you safe, but also kept you stuck. You became an expert at managing pain instead of healing it. And somewhere along the way, you started to believe that this was just how life was supposed to be. That struggle was your identity. That suffering was your story. That the version of you who could endure anything was the strongest version of you. But survival is not a destination. It's a temporary state. It's what you do when you have no other choice. When the only goal is to make it through the day, the week, the month. And you did that. You survived when survival was all that was available to you. But now, the universe is asking for something different. It's asking you to stop surviving and start thriving. And thriving requires a different version of you. It requires the version that knows when to say no. The version that doesn't confuse intensity with love, chaos with passion, or suffering with loyalty. The version that understands that true strength isn't about how much you can endure. It's about knowing what you no longer need to carry. That season stripped away the patterns you didn't even know you were repeating. The habit of abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable. The belief that your worth was measured by how much you could give even when you were already empty. The faith that was conditional, that only existed when things were going well, that crumbled the moment life got hard. All of that had to go. Not because it made you weak, but because it was keeping you from the life that's been waiting for you all along. You were isolated just enough to hear your own voice again. And I know how lonely that felt. I know how many nights you sat in the silence and wondered if anyone truly saw you, if anyone truly understood what you were going through. The invitations stopped coming. The messages slowed down. The people you thought would be there simply weren't. And in those moments, it felt like abandonment. It felt like the world had forgotten about you. like you had somehow become invisible, like your presence no longer mattered to anyone. But what if that isolation wasn't punishment? What if it was precision? What if the universe needed you to be still enough, quiet enough, alone enough to finally hear the truth that had been buried beneath all the noise? For so long, you had been surrounded by voices telling you who to be, how to live, what to want, what to fear. Voices from your past, from your family, from society, from people who loved you but didn't understand you. And those voices were so loud that you couldn't hear your own anymore. You couldn't hear the quiet knowing that lived in the center of your chest. You couldn't hear the intuition that was trying to guide you towards something truer, something deeper, something aligned with who you actually are. So the universe created space. It removed the distractions. It silenced the external noise. It placed you in a kind of sacred solitude where the only voice left was your own. And in that silence, something began to shift. You started to notice what truly mattered to you and what you had been doing out of obligation. You started to feel the difference between what energized you and what drained you. You started to recognize the patterns you had been repeating, the cycles you had been stuck in, the beliefs you had been carrying that were never even yours to begin with. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of clarity, full of truth, full of the answers you had been searching for everywhere except within yourself. When everything else falls away, when all the noise stops, the truth speaks. And you finally heard it. Think about how much you changed without realizing it. The shifts happened so quietly, so gradually, that you didn't see them as they were occurring. You were too focused on what wasn't working, on what still hurt, on what hadn't arrived yet. But if you pause for a moment and look back, really look back at who you were a year ago, you'll see it. You stopped chasing what drained you. There were people, situations, opportunities that you would have run after before, that you would have bent yourself into impossible shapes to hold on to. But somewhere in the middle of that difficult season, you simply stopped. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally understood that love shouldn't require you to lose yourself. That connection shouldn't feel like depletion. That belonging shouldn't mean abandoning your own needs, your own truth, your own peace. You stopped confusing intensity with love. You stopped mistaking drama for depth. You stopped believing that if it didn't hurt, it wasn't real. And in that stopping, in that quiet refusal to keep participating in dynamics that diminished you, you reclaimed a part of yourself that had been lost for far too long. You lost patience with what wasn't true, the small talk that led nowhere, the surface-level connections that required you to hide who you really were, the relationships that only existed as long as you played a certain role, as long as you didn't ask for too much, as long as you stayed convenient. You used to tolerate those things. You used to smile through them, convince yourself they were enough, tell yourself that this was just how life was. But now, something in you has changed. You can feel when something is authentic and when it's just performance. You can sense when someone truly sees you and when they're only seeing what they want from you, and you're no longer willing to pretend that the difference doesn't matter. This isn't coldness, this isn't bitterness, this isn't you becoming hard or closed off. This is clarity, this is discernment. This is you finally valuing yourself enough to stop accepting less than what you deserve. You didn't lose your softness, you refined it. There's a difference between being soft and being without boundaries, between being kind and being available to everyone regardless of how they treat you, between being open-hearted and leaving yourself unprotected in spaces that don't honor you. You used to think that softness meant saying yes to everything, that kindness meant never disappointing anyone, that love meant giving until there was nothing left of yourself. And that version of softness left you exhausted, resentful, and wondering why the people you poured into never seemed to pour back. But the fire of that difficult season didn't destroy your softness. It taught it discernment. It taught it when to open and when to close. It taught it that true kindness includes being kind to yourself, that real love doesn't require self-abandonment, that you can be gentle and still have edges, still have limits, still have a voice that says this far and no further. You didn't lose your faith. You tested it until it became unshakable. There were moments when your faith felt like it was crumbling, when you questioned everything you once believed, when you looked up at the sky and wondered if anyone was even listening. You prayed prayers that seemed to go unanswered. You set intentions that appeared to go nowhere. You tried to trust the process, while the process felt like it was breaking you. And in those moments, your faith wasn't lost. It was being forged. It was being stripped of everything that wasn't real, everything that was based on Tiaojian, on bargaining, on the belief that if you were good enough, faithful and patient enough, the universe would reward you on your timeline. That kind of faith is fragile. It only works when things go well. But the faith you have now, the faith that emerged from the fire, that's different. It doesn't require proof. It doesn't collapse when things get hard. It doesn't need everything to make sense in order to keep going. It's faith that has been tested and survived. And that kind of faith can carry you through anything. Seeds don't grow in light. They grow in darkness, silence, and pressure. They're buried beneath the surface where no one can see them, where there's no evidence of progress, no visible proof that anything is happening at all. And if you were to dig up that seed in the middle of its process, if you were to unearth it because you were afraid it wasn't working, you would find something that looks nothing like the plant it's becoming. You would find something broken open, split apart, unrecognizable from what it once was, and you might think it was dying. You might think the darkness was destroying it, but the truth is, that seed is doing exactly what it needs to do. It's surrendering its old form. It's using the pressure of the soil, the weight of the earth above it, the complete absence of light, to crack itself open and reach downward. Downward, not upward, because before anything can rise, it has to root. It has to anchor itself so deeply into the ground that no storm, no drought, no external force can pull it out. And that rooting process is invisible. No one sees it. No one applauds it. No one even knows it's happening. But it's the most important part. Without roots, there's no stability. Without roots, the first strong wind would knock it over. Without roots, there's nothing to draw from when the season gets hard. You were in the darkness. You were in the silence. You were under pressure that felt unbearable at times. And the entire time, while it looked like nothing was happening, while it felt like you were stuck, like you were going backwards, like all your efforts were pointless, you were rooting. You were developing a foundation strong enough to hold what's coming. You were growing in ways that no one could see, in ways you couldn't even see yourself. But just because it was invisible doesn't mean it wasn't real. Everything that matters happens in the unseen first, the thought before the action, the shift in belief before the change in circumstance, the internal transformation before the external manifestation. You were in the underground of your own evolution, and now, after all that time in the dark, after all that pressure, after all that silent growth, you're ready to break through the surface. A virada, receber em vez de sobreviver. What's ahead isn't about surviving, it's about receiving. And I know that might sound simple, but receiving is one of the hardest things for someone who has spent years in survival mode to do, because survival teaches you to grip, to control, to fight for every single thing, to never let your guard down, because the moment you do, something might be taken from you. Survival teaches you that rest is dangerous, that ease is temporary, that if something good happens, it's only a matter of time before it's ripped away. So you learn to brace yourself. You learn to expect the worst. You learn to protect your heart by never fully opening it, to protect your hopes by never fully believing in them, to protect yourself by staying just a little bit closed, just a little bit defended, just a little bit prepared for disappointment. But receiving requires something entirely different. Receiving requires surrender, not giving up, not resignation, not passive waiting, but the active choice to release control, to stop forcing, to stop trying to make things happen through sheer willpower, to stop micromanaging every detail of your life because you're terrified that if you don't, everything will fall apart. Receiving means trusting that what's meant for you will find you without you having to chase it, manipulate it, or convince it to stay. It means releasing timelines that were built on fear, on the belief that if it doesn't happen by a certain age, by a certain date, by a certain moment, then it's too late, then you've failed, then you've somehow missed your chance. But the universe doesn't operate on fear-based deadline. It operates on readiness, on alignment, on the perfect convergence of who you are and what you're calling. And that convergence can't be rushed. It can't be forced. It can only be allowed. Receiving also means trusting without needing to see the entire path laid out in front of you. It means taking the next step, even when you don't know where it leads. It means saying yes to opportunities that don't make logical sense, but feel right in your body. It means following the quiet pull of your intuition, even when everyone around you is telling you to play it safe, to stay where you are, to stop reaching for more. And perhaps most importantly, receiving means allowing without bargaining, without telling the universe exactly how it has to show up, exactly what form it has to take, exactly who has to be involved, and when and how. Because the moment you attach to a specific outcome, you close yourself off to the 1,000 other ways that blessings might be trying to reach you. Conclusion. One day, you will look back and realize that the heaviest year of your life taught you discernment. And discernment is what protects abundance once it arrives. Because abundance without discernment is just chaos. It's saying yes to everything and everyone, letting anything into your life simply because it's available, because it's shiny, because it promises something you've been waiting for. But you've learned something far more valuable than how to attract. You've learned how to discern, how to feel into what's truly aligned and what's just dressed up to look like it. How to recognize the difference between what you want and what you actually need. How to honor what serves your highest good, even when it means disappointing people, even when it means walking away from things that look perfect on the surface, but feel wrong in your soul. Some people won't recognize, and that's not a loss. That's a sign that you've outgrown the version of yourself they were comfortable with, the version that stayed small so they could feel big, the version that dimmed its light so they wouldn't feel threatened, the version that played roles, wore masks, contorted itself into shapes that were acceptable, palatable, easy to understand. But you're not that anymore. And the people who can't see you now, who look at you with confusion or judgment or distance, they're not meant to walk with you into this next chapter. Not because they're bad people, but because they're still resonating with who you used to be. And you can't take someone with you into a frequency they're not ready to hold. Some doors won't reopen. The job you thought you wanted, the relationship you thought you needed, the city you thought you were supposed to live in, the dream you thought defined your entire future. Those doors closed, and for a long time, you stood in front of them, knocking, begging, trying to find a way back in. But here's what you understand now. Those doors didn't close because you weren't good enough. They closed because you no longer fit in those spaces. Not because you lost something, but because you evolved beyond them. Because staying there would have required you to shrink back down, to pretend you hadn't grown, to act like the transformation never happened. And you can't do that. Not anymore. You've seen too much. You've felt too much. You've become too much of who you truly are to go back to living as a fraction of yourself. Write this as a line in the sand between who you were and who you're becoming. Not as a wish, not as a hope, but as a declaration. As a statement of truth that comes from the deepest part of you, the part that survived the fire and came out stronger, clearer, more aligned than ever before. Say it out loud if you need to. Whisper it if that feels more true. Write it down on paper and place it somewhere you'll see it every single day. Let these words become the bridge between the season that broke you open and the season that's about to unfold. I release the weight of the past season, and I am ready to receive what aligns with me now. Feel what happens in your body when you say that. Feel the way your chest might tighten for a moment, the way resistance might rise up, the way a part of you might want to hold on just a little bit longer to what was, to who you were, to the familiar pain that at least made sense. And then feel the release, the exhale, the softening, the quiet knowing that you don't have to carry that anymore, that it served its purpose, that it taught you everything it came to teach you, and now it's time to let it go. This video found you because you're ready, not because you have it all figured out, not because the fear is gone, not because you're suddenly perfect or healed or completely transformed, but because somewhere inside you, beneath all the doubt and the exhaustion and the wondering if you can really do this, there's a part of you that knows, a part of you that has always known, that this year, 2026, is when everything that was planted in the darkness finally breaks through the soil, when everything that was being prepared in the silence finally becomes visible, when everything that felt like it was falling apart was actually falling into place. Share this with someone who barely made it through the last year, someone who's still carrying the weight, still questioning if it was worth it, still wondering if they're strong enough for what's next. Let this be the confirmation they didn't endure all of that for nothing. Let this be the reminder that their pain had purpose, that their struggle had meaning, that every single moment of that impossible season was preparing them for something they can't even imagine yet. Linha, final. You didn't survive the hardest season just to repeat it. You survived it to rise beyond it, to step into a version of your life that the old you couldn't have even imagined. Not because you weren't capable, but because you weren't ready, because you hadn't yet developed the roots, the discernment, the unshakable faith that this new chapter requires. But now you have. Now you've been through the fire and you didn't burn. You were refined. Now you've been in the darkness and you didn't disappear. You were growing, rooting, becoming. Now you've been stripped of everything that wasn't truly yours, and you're standing here, still breathing, still believing, still open to what's possible. That's not luck. That's not coincidence. That's the universe recognizing that you're finally ready to receive what you've been asking for, what you've been praying for, what your soul has been calling in since the beginning. And 2026 is the year it all unfolds. Not because the calendar changed, not because time magically heals, but because you changed, because you let go of what needed to be released, because you stopped surviving and started surrendering, because you stopped forcing and started allowing, because you became someone who can hold abundance without losing yourself in it, someone who can receive love without abandoning themselves for it, someone who can step into their purpose without doubting that they belong there. Everything that happened, everything that hurt, everything that felt like it was breaking you, it was all leading you here, to this moment, to this knowing, to this readiness. You didn't come this far to stay where you are. You came this far to rise.